The freighter drifted silently through the void of space, its crew unaware of the mistake. They were about to make the stars stretched out in front of them a path of endless black. The ship hummed with the low whir of its engines as it moved through the dark expanse of the galaxy. And then it happened, a sudden flash on the radar, an unexpected signal came in. The freighter had crossed into a region of space that had been uncharted by human hands. The Xeric Empire controlled this part of the galaxy, their ships like predators in the night, waiting for anything to stray too close. The crew on board had no idea who they were dealing with. They were just a group of merchants hoping to make a trade run across the stars to supply the colony on Hesperides, a distant mining world. They had no business being near the Xeric homeworld, no business trespassing in a place where survival was never a guarantee. Still, they carried on, oblivious to the danger that lurked ahead. The Xeric ships appeared from the darkness like shadows, swallowing the stars in their wake. Enormous battle cruisers armed with weapons capable of decimating entire planets. They hailed the freighter, but their message was simple and brutal: surrender or perish. The Xeric had no time for negotiation or explanation. Their empire had conquered so many worlds that their sense of superiority had no bounds. The freighter captains sent a response, a simple statement to tell the Xeric to go to hell. And just like that, the message was sent out, and with it the fate of the crew was sealed. The Xeric did not take kindly to defiance. Their ships moved into position, quickly surrounding the freighter on all sides, weapons primed and ready for destruction. The crew scrambled, trying to understand what was happening. A few had already begun to realize their mistake, but it was far too late. The Xeric did not wait for compliance. They did not wait for fear or pleading. They fired upon the freighter with an overwhelming force. A ship's hull buckled under the blast, and the crew were caught in the crossfire. As the ship broke apart, the space around them was filled with fire and debris. The Xeric didn't bother to finish the job. There was no need. They had made their point. Humanity was insignificant. They thought the humans were too weak to survive in the galaxy. But they had underestimated something vital, a spark of defiance that still burned in the hearts of every human being. As the Xeric ships pulled away, leaving the wreckage behind, they didn't expect the aftermath that would come. The humans didn't cower, they didn't break, they didn't beg. They stood tall, even as their worlds seemed to crumble around them. Humanity would respond in a way the Xeric had never anticipated. They would fight back. The transmission was sent to Earth, a single message from the captain of the freighter to anyone who would listen, a message that was clear as the stars themselves: we don't bow. And with that one declaration, the fate of humanity began to change forever. The news spread like wildfire across Earth. The message from the freighter captain broadcast to every corner of the globe. We don't bow. The words echoed through every city, every home. It was the rallying cry humanity had been waiting for centuries, a call to arms, a declaration of defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. It ignited something deep inside the human spirit, a fire that had lain dormant for too long, something that had been buried under the weight of history. But now it was alive and burning brighter than ever before. Governments scrambled to respond. The United Nations convened emergency sessions. Representatives from every nation rushed to assemble a united front. The world's military leaders gathered in secretive meetings, drawing up plans of resistance. Even as the odds stacked higher against them, Earth's people united like never before. While the Xeric had seen them as weak and insignificant, they were about to discover just how wrong they were. The first wave of human retaliation was crude, at best hastily assembled fleets and makeshift weapons. But humanity had something that the Xeric never could understand: a relentless drive to survive and adapt against all odds. The human military was no longer a collection of disparate forces working independently. It was a single unified force, working with one goal in mind: to show the galaxy that they were no longer prey, that they were here to stay. Behind the scenes, brilliant minds began working on new technologies. They worked day and night on everything from advanced weapons to new defensive systems. Their resources were stretched thin and time was running out, but their resolve was ironclad. Every scientist, every engineer, every soldier knew what was at stake: their world, their future. It all hung in the balance, and they could not afford to fail. In the darkest corners of human society, a new breed of fighters emerged. Individuals who had once been overlooked now became the front line of this war against the Xeric. They were the scrappers, the survivors, the ones who lived on the edge of the law and the fringes of society, but now they were the ones called upon to fight. They were the ones who knew how to think on their feet, how to survive. When there was no hope, they were the ones who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. The first real test came when a Xerac scouting party entered human space. They were fast and powerful, expecting an easy sweep through the uncharted region of human colonies. They encountered resistance, but it was nothing they had anticipated. The humans fought back with such ferocity, such unpredictability, that the Xerac were caught off guard. Their highly disciplined forces were thrown into chaos for the first time in the war. The Xerac faced uncertainty. They began to realize that humanity was not the weakling they thought it was. A new kind of war was being fought now: guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run strategies, sabotage of supply lines. Every human became a soldier, whether they were on the front lines or behind a desk at home. They all contributed in their own way. It was a war of ingenuity and willpower. It was a war that humans were determined to win no matter what the cost. The galaxy watched on as the humans refused to give in. They mocked humanity, at first calling them fools to think they could stand against the Xerac. But as the weeks passed and the skirmishes continued to build, they began to see something in the humans that they had not expected: tenacity. Every loss was met with renewed determination. Every setback only made humanity push harder. In hidden chambers across the galaxy, the leaders of other species began to whisper about humanity, about the humans' unexpected defiance against a foe like the Xerac. They started to question their earlier assumptions. Perhaps the humans weren't as weak as they had thought. Perhaps there was more to them than meets the eye. And then a message was sent from a faction of alien species who had long kept to themselves, a message of alliance. They had seen the Xerac's cruelty firsthand and had no love for their methods. They offered their technology and expertise to humanity in exchange for one thing: help in taking down the Xerac before they consumed everything in their path. It was an offer too tempting to ignore, and it set the stage for the next phase of the war. Humanity's fight was about to get a lot more complicated. As humanity began to organize itself into a cohesive force, the stakes of the conflict grew ever higher. The Xerac had underestimated them in their arrogance, and now the humans were showing them the cost of that mistake. The first human counterattack took place on a small moon orbiting the gas giant of Viridian. It wasn't much, but it was something. The Xerac had no reason to suspect an attack from a location so insignificant, but the humans did it anyway. They knew the Xerac would never see it coming. A fleet of makeshift ships launched from Earth's orbit, made up of civilian vessels retrofitted for combat. The mission was simple and reckless: strike fast, cause as much damage as possible, and get out before the Xerac even knew what had hit them. They attacked with precision and audacity, hitting a Xerac refinery and causing a massive explosion that sent shockwaves throughout the nearby system. The Xerac were furious, but the humans had already vanished into the void by the time the Xerac arrived to retaliate. The galaxy watched in stunned silence as humanity had proven that it could hurt the Xerac in ways that no one had thought possible. The galaxy had always assumed that humans were weak, fragile creatures, unable to withstand the unrelenting power of the Xerac. But the first strike was a message to the stars: the humans were not here to be anyone's punching bag. They were here to make their mark. It wasn't just the military that rose to the challenge. Ordinary civilians began to take action. Those who could fight joined the military, while others formed resistance cells on planets that were already under Xerac control. The resistance movement began to grow as humans refused to let the Xerac subjugate them. They sabotaged supply lines, intercepted communications, and created chaos wherever they could. The Xerac had expected a quick and easy victory, but now they found themselves bogged down in a war of attrition, a war where every move the humans made seemed to hurt them in ways they hadn't predicted. Back on Earth, the preparation for the larger battle was underway. Entire industries were repurposed to create weapons, armor, and ships. For the war effort, humanity was mobilizing at an unprecedented rate. Technology that once seemed like science fiction was becoming reality. Engineers worked day and night to develop new weapon systems that could stand toe-to-toe with the Xerac's mighty warships. The atmosphere on Earth was tense. Everyone knew that the war was far from over, and that the true battle was just beginning. In the dark corners of the galaxy, factions of other species watched as the humans fought back with growing admiration. Some were motivated by the sheer audacity of humanity. Others saw in the humans a raw potential they had not expected. Perhaps this was an opportunity to topple the Zerak's reign once and for all. Some began to reach out to humanity, offering knowledge, technology, and most importantly their support. The Wyvra, a species known for their cold neutrality, were the first to extend a hand. They had no love for the Zerak, having suffered under their conquests in the past, but they had never interfered in galactic conflicts until now. The Wyvra offered humanity advanced technology in exchange for one thing: help in defeating the Zerak once and for all. Humanity's leaders were hesitant at first. The Wyvra had their own motivations, and their offer seemed too good to be true. But after careful consideration, and with the looming threat of complete annihilation, humanity accepted the offer of the Wyvra and began to work together in secret to develop strategies and weapons that would turn the tide of the war. Now humanity had allies and weapons of unimaginable power. They had made their first mark on the galaxy, and with the backing of the Wyvra, they began to strike deeper into Zerak territory. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore, they were fighting for the future of the galaxy. They were fighting to prove that humanity would not be crushed under the weight of the stars. The Zerak were starting to realize that this war wasn't going to be as easy as they thought. Humanity had evolved into something more than they could comprehend, something deadly and unrelenting, something the galaxy would soon never forget. The first real strike against the Zerak was a gamble, a mission that carried enormous risks, but humanity's military knew it had no choice. The resistance cells had discovered something crucial, a hidden Zerak flagship that was said to hold the key to their command structure. If they could take it down, it would cripple the Zerak's ability to coordinate their forces and create chaos within their ranks. The ship was positioned deep in enemy territory and heavily guarded, but the humans had something the Zerak didn't expect: desperation. A small group of elite soldiers led the mission. They were the best humanity had to offer, trained in every form of combat. They infiltrated Zerak-controlled space aboard an unmarked human vessel modified for stealth. They traveled through enemy lines without making a sound. The tension on the ship was palpable. Every crew member knew the stakes. If they failed their mission, it could mean the death of thousands, if not millions more innocent lives would be lost. But if they succeeded, it could turn the tide of the war. The closer they got, the more dangerous it became. Zerak patrols scanned the area, their ships constantly scanning for intruders. It was a waiting game. The humans had to outthink the Zerak at every turn. Avoiding detection was the first challenge. But they had a secret weapon, their own ingenuity. Human technology was still new to the galaxy, but it was rapidly improving. New stealth systems had been developed with the help of the Wyvra, and they worked like a charm for now. As the human squad neared the flagship, the Zerak ships became more frequent and aggressive, their weapons trained on every possible point of entry. The team was running out of time. They had to make their move, and fast. But even with all that planning, nothing could prepare them for the first wave of Zerak resistance. The moment they'd breached the outer defenses, the alarm sounded, and the flagship went into full lockdown. What followed was a brutal battle. The human squad was outnumbered and outgunned, but they fought with everything they had. The team leader, a seasoned veteran from Earth, called for every ounce of strength they could muster as Zerak soldiers poured into the corridors of the flagship. They fought their way through the ship's heart, each soldier moving with purpose, every step calculated, every shot fired with precision they couldn't afford to miss. The Zerak were ruthless, but the humans had something they didn't. They had a belief in the cause, something to fight for, something that transcended their own survival. They had the future of the galaxy in their hands, and it made them stronger than they could have ever imagined. It wasn't just the soldiers on the ground that made the difference. Back on Earth, human engineers worked tirelessly to crack the Zerak communication networks. They infiltrated their systems, feeding false information, scrambling orders, and sowing confusion within the Zerak fleets. As the battle raged on, the humans outside the flagship worked to take down Zerak defenses and prevent any reinforcements from arriving. The humans were coordinated, they were agile, and they were relentless. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the team reached the Zerak command center, the heart of the flagship, and the core of their operations, the commander of the flagship, stood there waiting, expecting their death. But the humans had other plans. With a single strike, they disabled the command center's core, sending a ripple of confusion through the Xerac fleet. The flagship's systems began to fail, and the Xerac were left in chaos. The human squad didn't stop there. They detonated the flagship's engines, causing an enormous explosion that sent shockwaves throughout the area. The Xerac fleet was thrown into disarray, ships collided, and communications went dark. For a brief moment, the humans had crippled their enemy. The Xerac flagship lay in ruins, and the once unbreakable line of their command had been shattered. The aftermath was just as critical, though the humans knew they had won at battle, but the war was far from over. The Xerac were not easily defeated, and they would retaliate with everything they had. But for the first time in the war, the humans had struck a blow that was felt across the galaxy. The Xerac were no longer the unstoppable force they had once been. Humanity had shown the galaxy that they were a force to be reckoned with, and the spark that had ignited in the hearts of their soldiers was now a fire that would burn throughout the stars. As the dust settled from the explosion of the Xerac flagship, the humans stood victorious. But they knew better than to celebrate too early. The battle had been a blow to the Xerac, but it had also drawn their attention. Humanity had made its first major strike, and now the Xerac would respond in force with a vengeance. Humanity couldn't afford to sit back. They had to build on their success and move fast because time was running out. It wasn't long before a new message arrived across the galaxy, a signal from the Wyvra, the alien species, who had extended their offer of alliance to humanity in exchange for help against the Xerac. The message was short, but clear. The Wyvra had seen enough of the Xerac's cruelty, and they knew that humanity had proven itself to be more than just a nuisance. They had seen potential in the humans, potential that could tip the balance in the war. The Wyvra were ready to offer more than just technology. They were ready to offer humanity the key to a weapon that could change the course of the conflict. The weapon wasn't just a ship or a fleet of ships. It was a piece of technology that the Wyvra had kept secret for centuries, a piece of technology that could manipulate space itself, a device capable of creating wormholes on command, allowing ships to travel across the galaxy in the blink of an eye. The Wyvra had used it for their own purposes in the past, but they had never shared it with anyone before. Now humanity would be the first to wield it. The Wyvra were cautious about their decision. They knew the power of such technology could be catastrophic in the wrong hands, but they also knew that humanity's drive to survive made them worthy of it. If they could harness the power of the wormhole generator, they could strike at the heart of the Xerac's empire, hit them where they least expected, and perhaps even defeat them once and for all. At first, humanity was hesitant. The power of such a weapon was tempting, but it came with a heavy cost. The Wyvra made it clear that the technology could be dangerous if misused, and that the consequences of failure would be disastrous. The decision to use it would not be taken lightly, but humanity had already shown its willingness to fight and sacrifice everything for their survival, and they knew that if they didn't take this opportunity, the Xerac would destroy them all. With the Wyvra's blessing, humanity began to work on understanding and mastering the wormhole generator. Engineers worked tirelessly studying the ancient technology, while military leaders planned their next move. They were in uncharted territory, but that didn't stop them. Humanity's ingenuity had always been its greatest asset, and they would make the most of what they had. Meanwhile, the Xerac were regrouping and preparing for their own counteroffensive. They knew that the humans were no longer the weaklings they had once thought them to be, and the galaxy began to see a shift in the balance of power. The Xerac had never faced an enemy like humanity before, a species that refused to bow to their might, a species that fought with everything it had. And now, with the wormhole generator in their hands, humanity was preparing to take the war to the Xerac's doorstep. The humans gathered their forces and coordinated with the Wyvra as the final preparations were made for the next phase of the war. They would strike at the Xerac's heart. They would move faster than the enemy could react and hit them where it hurt the most. The Xerac had been the predators of the galaxy for so long, but now it was time for humanity to prove that they could be just as dangerous. As the final battle loomed on the horizon, The stakes had never been higher. The galaxy was watching, and humanity was ready to show that it was no longer just a pawn in the grand game of power. It was ready to change the rules of that game forever. As the humans prepared to deploy the wormhole generator, they knew that the risks were great, but so were the rewards. The Zirac would never expect such a bold move. And that was exactly what they were counting on. The weapon had the potential to alter the course of the war, and humanity was ready to push forward with everything they had. Their military forces were bolstered by the new technology. They had learned to wield it quickly and efficiently. It was time to strike. The first target was the heart of the Zirac Empire, their homeworld, a planet shrouded in mystery and heavily guarded by an armada of ships. The humans had no intention of defeating the entire fleet. No, they had a different strategy. The wormhole generator would allow them to bypass the Zirac defenses entirely and strike at the core of their command structure, where their leaders resided. The humans knew that if they could take down the leaders, it would send the Zirac Empire into disarray. It would show the galaxy that the humans had become a force that could challenge anyone, even the might of the Zirac. The final plan was set. The fleet was assembled, and the wormhole generator was ready. The humans had managed to refine the technology to the point where they could use it to travel across vast distances in an instant. It was a game changer. The galaxy had never seen anything like it before, and it was humanity's ace in the hole. They would use it to strike fast and hard and leave the Zirac reeling. The night before the assault, a sense of anticipation filled the human ranks. They knew this would be the turning point of the war. If they succeeded, it would be the first step toward reclaiming their freedom. If they failed, it could mean the end of everything they had fought for. The weight of the moment was heavy on their shoulders. But they didn't falter. They had come too far to turn back now. At the appointed hour, the fleet launched from Earth's orbit and made its way into Zirac territory. The wormhole generator was activated, and the humans watched in awe as the stars seemed to bend and twist before them in an instant. They were there in the heart of Zirac space. They had arrived with no warning, no time for the enemy to prepare. The strike was swift and deadly. The first wave of human ships emerged from the wormhole and immediately launched an assault on the Zirac's outer defenses. The Zirac ships responded quickly, but they were unprepared for the humans' speed and precision. The wormhole had given the humans the element of surprise, and they wasted no time in taking full advantage of it. Within moments, the Zirac fleet was thrown into chaos. Their ships scrambled to regroup and mount a counterattack. But it was already too late. The humans had made their presence known, and they were not backing down. The wormhole generator opened again, and another wave of human ships emerged behind the first. The assault was relentless. The Zirac struggled to form a defense against the sheer unpredictability of the human tactics. No longer confined to the traditional methods of battle, the humans were striking at unexpected angles, using the wormholes to keep the Zirac off balance and unable to respond quickly enough. As the battle raged on, the Zirac began to realize the true nature of the threat humanity posed. They had never anticipated a foe that could strike from anywhere at any time. They had grown accustomed to being the predators, but now they were the prey, and it shook them to their core. The human fleet pushed deeper into Zirac space, using the wormholes to bypass defenses and strike at the heart of their empire. The Zirac's central command had never been so vulnerable, and humanity took full advantage of the opening. They made their way to the capital planet, a world rich with resources and home to the leaders of the Zirac Empire. The Zirac tried to organize a defense, but it was too little too late. The humans had already infiltrated the planet and taken out key military command centers before the Zirac could rally their forces. The human assault was like a tidal wave, overwhelming their defenses and striking with such speed and ferocity that the Zirac had no time to regroup. As the human forces moved through the capital city, they reached the core of the Zirac leadership. It was there that the final confrontation would take place. The Zirac High Command stood in their fortified palace, unaware of the chaos unfolding outside. They had believed their rule was absolute, but humanity was about to prove them wrong. The battle for the palace was fierce and brutal, but in the end humanity stood victorious. The Zirac leaders were captured, and the once impenetrable empire of the Xerac began to crumble under the weight of the human resistance. As the Xerac Empire began to unravel with their leadership captured and their central command in disarray, humanity pressed forward with relentless determination. The victory on their capital world sent shockwaves through the galaxy. The Xerac had once been seen as untouchable rulers of an empire that stretched across the stars. Now, they were on the defensive. Humanity had proven that even the greatest empires could fall, but they knew the war was far from over. The Xerac were not a species to surrender easily, and they would retaliate with everything they had left. Humanity's leadership knew this all too well, and they wasted no time in preparing for the inevitable counterattack. Earth's forces were stretched thin after so many battles, and the resources needed to maintain such a large-scale war were running out. They needed reinforcements, they needed allies. The message went out to the galaxy, a call to arms, a plea for help from all the factions who had watched as humanity fought and bled for their survival. Some answered the call more eagerly than others, but they all came together. In the end, they came because they knew that if the Xerac succeeded in crushing humanity, it would set a precedent that no one would be safe from their tyranny. The Livra were the first to offer their full support, sending their fleet and advanced technologies to bolster humanity's forces. The Livra ships were sleek and deadly, their weaponry unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen, and their tactical knowledge of the Xerac gave humanity a significant advantage. But the Livra were not the only ones to join the fight. A number of lesser-known species who had long been oppressed by the Xerac began to rise up as well. They formed a loose coalition with humanity at its center, each faction contributing its strength in whatever way it could. Meanwhile, the Xerac had retreated to their strongholds, regrouping and consolidating their forces. They knew that their empire was on the brink of collapse, and they would stop at nothing to crush the rebellion once and for all. They began to marshal their remaining fleets into a final strike. They would use everything at their disposal, including their deadliest weapon, a fleet of dreadnoughts designed to break any enemy in their path. These ships were equipped with enough firepower to level entire worlds, and they were headed straight for humanity's home system. On Earth, the mood was one of grim resolve. The people knew what was coming, and they knew that this battle would determine the future of their species. The war had taken a heavy toll on their society, but they had adapted, they had come together in ways they never thought possible, and now they were ready for the final fight. The fleet was assembled. The Livra ships took their place alongside humanity's newly built warships, and the combined forces stood ready to meet the Xerac head-on. The day of the final battle arrived. The two fleets faced off in the vastness of space above Earth. The Xerac's dreadnoughts gleamed in the darkness, their weaponry primed for destruction. Humanity's forces were smaller, but they had something the Xerac didn't have. They had the element of surprise, and the new tactics they had developed using the wormhole technology. Humanity could strike anywhere at any time, and the Xerac couldn't predict their next move. The battle began with a fierce exchange of firepower. Xerac dreadnoughts unleashed their devastating energy blasts, while humanity's fleet darted in and out of the fray using the wormhole generator to appear and disappear in the blink of an eye. The fight was chaotic, with explosions ripping through space and ships falling under the sheer weight of firepower. But humanity's forces held firm. They had learned how to fight in the chaos of war, and now they were using every trick at their disposal to outmaneuver the Xerac. As the battle raged on, the Xerac were pushed back, their dreadnoughts damaged, and their fleet fragmented. They had underestimated humanity's ability to adapt, to survive, and to fight with everything they had. In their desperation, the Xerac commander ordered a final assault, a desperate push to crush humanity once and for all, but it was too little too late. Humanity's fleet made one last push, a coordinated strike that pierced the heart of the Xerac's remaining fleet. Their command ship was disabled, and the remaining Xerac forces scattered into disarray, with their leadership in disarray and their ships in ruins. The Xerac were broken, their empire lay in ruins. Humanity had done the impossible. They had brought down the most powerful empire in the galaxy and had proven to the stars that they would never bow to anyone. As the final remnants of the Xerac fleet retreated into the dark corners of the galaxy, humanity stood victorious. But it was a hollow victory. The cost had been enormous. The war had taken its toll, not just in lives lost, but in the very fabric of human society. Entire cities had been destroyed, countless worlds had been ravaged, and millions of innocent people had died in the wake of the Zirak's brutal conquest. Yet, despite the pain and the loss, humanity had shown its strength, its ability to endure, and to rise up against the most overwhelming odds. The galaxy was now watching as humanity began to rebuild their shattered world. It would take years to recover. The scars of war would not fade quickly, but humanity's spirit remained unbroken. The humans, who had once been viewed as a fragile species, now stood as a testament to resilience and strength. They had proven themselves capable of challenging the galaxy's greatest powers and emerging victorious. In the aftermath of the war, the galaxy was left in a delicate balance. The Zirak had been shattered, their empire no longer a dominant force, but the power vacuum they left behind was vast and dangerous. Many factions now sought to claim what remained of the Zirak's territory, but humanity was not interested in conquering or expanding. They had fought for their survival, and they would not be drawn into further conflicts unless absolutely necessary. Instead, they focused on diplomacy and rebuilding the fractured galaxy. Humanity's leaders reached out to the various species and factions that had aided them in the war and offered a new path forward, one of cooperation and peace. The Yivra, who had been instrumental in humanity's victory, stood by their side as allies, their advanced technologies and knowledge proving invaluable in the rebuilding effort. Together, humanity and the Yivra began to form the foundations of a new alliance, one that would help prevent any further galaxy-wide conflicts and ensure that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. Other species that had once been under Zirak control also joined in the peace talks, and soon the galaxy began to see the first signs of cooperation between races that had once been locked in centuries of conflict. The war had brought them together, and now they all sought to create a more stable and peaceful future. But not all factions were content with peace. Some of the more aggressive species saw the human victory as a threat rather than an opportunity. These factions believed that humanity had become too powerful, too influential in the galaxy, and they feared the rise of a new empire that could challenge their own dominance. Tensions began to simmer beneath the surface, and while humanity worked toward rebuilding its shattered civilization, there were whispers of rebellion and resistance from factions who wanted to reclaim the power the Zirak had once held. These factions were well organized and well funded, and their influence spread quickly through the galaxy. Humanity's leaders knew that the fight was not truly over. Despite the victory of the Zirak, the galaxy was still a dangerous place, and there would always be forces that sought to disrupt the fragile peace that had been achieved. It could not rest on their laurels. The rebuilding process had to continue, and it had to be done carefully. They had to show the galaxy that humanity was not interested in domination, but in a shared future. In the wake of their victory, humanity became the center of attention. The galaxy watched to see what their next move would be. Would they rise to the challenge of leading the galaxy, or would they fall victim to the very chaos they had just overcome? Humanity stood at a crossroads. The future was uncertain, and the path ahead would be fraught with challenges. But one thing was clear: humanity had earned its place in the stars, and they would not let anyone take it away. The road to lasting peace would be long and difficult, but humanity was no longer the underdog. They had proven themselves, and now they would lead by example. As the years passed, the galaxy slowly began to heal. The scars of war never fully faded, but humanity's influence grew stronger with each passing day. They rebuilt their cities, their governments, and their relationships with the other species who had fought alongside them during the war. The scars of the Zirak were still visible across the galaxy, but humanity had made it their mission to ensure that the lessons of the past were never forgotten, and that the peace they fought for would not be taken for granted. Humanity's leadership understood that true peace would not be won by force alone. It would require diplomacy, compromise, and the ability to adapt to an ever-changing galaxy. The Federation of Free Species was born out of the ashes of the war, a coalition of the races who had fought against the Zirak and the others who had joined in the struggle for freedom. This new government was not just a human effort, but a galactic one, and it was their greatest achievement. Humanity had shown that unity could be more powerful than division, that cooperation could overcome the greatest of enemies. But even as the new Federation began to grow and prosper, there were those who remained skeptical of humanity's rise to power the factions that had once been the Xerak's allies, or those who had taken advantage of the chaos saw humanity's growing influence as a threat. And while the galaxy seemed to be at peace on the surface, there were whispers of rebellion simmering in the dark corners of the universe. Humanity was aware of these threats, and they knew that their peace was fragile. The Federation had to remain vigilant and proactive. They had to ensure that no one would be allowed to tear apart what they had worked so hard to build. But they also understood that peace could not be maintained by war alone. It would require diplomacy and negotiation to ensure that the factions that still harbored resentment would not escalate into another conflict. Humanity's greatest strength was its ability to adapt. Its people had proven themselves in battle, and now they proved themselves in governance and diplomacy. The humans had shown that their strength did not come from their weapons or their military might, but from their determination to survive and to make a better future for everyone in the galaxy. The Federation's first great test came when a rogue faction of former Xerak supporters began to rally under a new banner. They were not content with the peace that had been established and sought to restore the old ways of domination and conquest. They rallied support from various sectors, promising power and riches to those who would join their cause. The Federation's leaders knew that this faction could not be ignored, but they also knew that to engage in battle again would be to undo all the progress they had made. Instead, they sent envoys to meet with the leaders of this rogue faction. They offered dialogue, they offered a path toward peaceful resolution. But the rogue faction was not interested in peace. They were determined to bring the galaxy back under Xerak rule, no matter the cost. The negotiations broke down quickly, and the Federation was left with no choice but to take action. But humanity's military was not what it had once been. Their forces had been restructured, and many of the experienced soldiers from the war had transitioned into peacekeeping and rebuilding roles. The battle would be different this time. It would not be a war of total annihilation, but a struggle for the very ideals that humanity had fought for. In the end, the rogue faction was defeated, not through overwhelming force, but through determination and the power of unity. The Federation's coalition stood strong, and together they showed that the ideals of peace and cooperation could not be so easily undone. The galaxy had seen what humanity was capable of, and now they saw that humanity would not allow anyone to bring back the darkness of war. With the rogue faction dismantled, the galaxy began to move forward once more. The Federation grew stronger, and the future seemed brighter, but the galaxy would always be a place of uncertainty, and the lessons learned from the Xerak War would never be forgotten. Humanity had proven that they could overcome the greatest of threats, and now they would ensure that they would never again be taken by surprise. The final victory had been won, but the true challenge lay ahead in maintaining the peace they had earned and building a galaxy that would not be torn apart by the mistakes of the past. Humanity had earned its place in the stars, and they would fight to keep it.